Hi, in this video we're going to be looking at an overview for task 1 of the IELTS writing test. If you remember, in the last video we were looking at an introduction for this task. Now of course we're going to continue looking at this task, but instead of looking at the introduction, we're going to be moving on to the next paragraph and thinking about how to write an overview. Some people find it a bit strange that we write an overview in the second paragraph. Of course, it's kind of like a summary, and some people would expect to see a summary at the end of a piece of writing. But for IELTS writing task 1, the overview is very, very important, and I think it should come near the beginning of the writing to make sure we write a high quality overview and we're not rushing at the end of our writing to get an overview or a summary done. Also, it follows a nice kind of logical structure in the paragraphing, in that we start with nice simple paragraphs and we're gradually getting more complex, because the paragraphs we're writing after the overview are going to be more complex. They involve the details of the graph, more specific information that we'll have to be comparing. But more of that in the video after this. We want to focus on the overview in this video and how we're going to write that. So of course it's on these two line graphs that we can see here. And in general, I'll recommend that students use 2 sentences for their overview. One more sentence than we used for the introduction. So we're gradually building the sizes of these paragraphs that we're using. So if we have 2 sentences for an overview that's focused on these 2 line graphs, of course, really what is most logical is to have 1 sentence on each of those graphs. 1 sentence on the graph that's showing the ownership of 3 different electrical appliances, and 1 sentence on the amount of hours of housework. So we're going to have 2 separate sentences. Now, if we think about what we're going to include in those sentences, we've got to think about what is obvious when we look at these 2 graphs. What can you easily see here? We don't want to go into any specific details. We just want to give some general information, the general idea. But we need to give a little bit more than what we gave in the introduction. We don't just want to be repeating what we said in the introduction. So we're looking here for overall trends, whether they're similar or different, and what are these overall changes from beginning to end. We don't want to look at any specific information in the middle of the graph. We're just looking at the beginning and the end and those overall changes. Also, for some graphs, if there's a overall highest or lowest, then we might want to include that detail as well. But for these 2 graphs, really we're just looking at the trends from beginning to end, and we're going to be comparing some of them. So what we're going to do in the first sentence of our overview is really look at the overall change of ownership of all 3 of these appliances, because they've all got something in common. We can see an increase in the ownership of all 3 appliances. None of them have experienced a decrease in ownership. So that's a way that we can group all 3 together in our first sentence. So that's going to be the first part of the sentence, where we're going to look at the overall increase of the ownership of all 3 types. But we're not going to finish there, because there's a little bit extra I can include in this first sentence as well. If you notice in this graph, one of the appliances experienced a much bigger increase than the other two. And you can see that it was the ownership of refrigerators. You can see then that that is a really big increase, and bigger than the increases of the other two types of appliances. So we might also follow on that sentence, include in the same sentence that that experienced the highest increase, or the most significant increase. Now, in our second sentence, of course, that's going to be focused on the second graph. Now, there's really not much here, right? We're not really going to be comparing anything because there's just one line on the graph. And we can see that there is a change, but we can see it's not an increase, it's a decrease in the number of hours that people spend doing housework. And it's an overall kind of decrease over that period of time. So we'll have quite a simple sentence describing that. So let's have a look at the actual overview. Now we've thought about, well, what we're putting in it. And I'll just analyze it a little bit and show you some of the kind of good things that we've done in here that are going to ensure that we get a nice high score. So here's the first sentence of the overview. Notice here how we begin our overview with the phrase, "It is clear that." This is a nice phrase to begin an overview. It shows that you're, well, beginning an overview, saying that something is clear. It really shows the examiner that this is what we're doing. Okay, it's this kind of discourse marker that they're looking for when you're writing an overview. And then you can see here we've continued and we said there was a rise in the ownership of all three electrical appliances. So we've grouped, like I said, all three of these appliances together and we've described the trend. A rise. Here we're using rise as a noun, a rise in something. It's quite a common phrase to use in task 1 of the IELTS writing test. Now we haven't finished there, so we've got a comma. And then we've continued the information because we're kind of explaining the increase in a bit more detail here, but not exactly comparing. So we use the conjunction and. Then we've said, and refrigerators saw by far the most significant increase over the 100-year period. So we've done a couple of nice things here. Of course, we've described the trend with the word increase. And we've used increase as a noun, just like we used rise as a noun, but we changed the vocabulary a little bit. We have also used an adjective to describe that trend because we're being more specific here. We can't do that with the rise because there were different types of rises with the three electrical appliances. But here we're focusing on one, so we can use a nice adjective to describe the increase, significant. And also, well, we're using the superlative, the most significant increase. Also, we've even described it in more detail by comparing it with the others by saying by far the most significant. So it's a lot more significant than the other two electrical appliances. We've got this massive increase compared with the other two increases that we can see with the ownership of other electrical appliances. We can see here also, well, we've used the noun form, so we've actually used the verb see, but in the past tense, saw. Right? Refrigerators saw by far the most significant increase. And we've got a time expression to just make it clear that we're talking about the same period of time that we mentioned in the introduction in the last video. And we've used a slightly different way of saying that, over the 100-year period. Nice and clear there. Of course, that sentence is quite long. It means in the second sentence of our overview, we don't need to write quite as much. And of course, we really don't need to because the second graph there doesn't include quite as much information. Now, if we move on to the second sentence here, we can see that we've begun by saying in terms of the amount of housework done per week. So we've moved on, made it clear that we're looking at something different now. Not the ownership of electrical appliances, but about the amount of housework that people do per week. And you can see here in the next part of that sentence, all we've said is the number of hours decreased considerably. Now, there's something you really should notice here, that we've used a different kind of sentence to describe this change. We're not using a noun to describe the change here, like we did in the previous sentence with increase and rise. We're using decrease as a verb here, and with an adverb considerably. So we're showing a bit of range of grammar. You can see, of course, again, we're just using the past simple tense. Decrease has a D on the end, so we're using the past simple there. And of course, that fits because we're looking at something that happens in the past. So there we go. That would be a pretty good overview to describe this, well, these two graphs. Now, of course, we're not finished with this task yet. We've got to go on and write 2 more paragraphs that are going to get even more complex, really, because we're going to be looking at the specific details in that graph that we can describe and compare. I'll leave that for the next writing video that I do, though, because we don't want to do too much in one video and make things more confusing. Hopefully that kind of explanation of an overview helped you quite a lot, kind of thinking about how you're going to approach writing overviews for line graph tasks. If the video was helpful, then do remember to click the like button, and if you haven't already, remember to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any similar videos in the future. There we go. Thanks for watching, and see you again in the next video.